Good morning, friends. I'm so glad you could be with me today, and thanks for joining me in our Unfolding the Word studies. We've had a break for a few days. I've been sick with COVID and just gradually working myself back. Glad we could join today, however. I want to pick up our reading in the book of Daniel in chapter 2, starting in verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. We've been looking at this impossible situation, chapter 2 of Daniel, that Daniel and his friends were now facing. You remember God had sent a dream to King Nebuchadnezzar, a dream that greatly troubled him. He turned to the Magi, the intelligence group of the day, the think tank, and demanded of them that they interpret the dream, and more than that they come up with what the dream was about without being told the dream. And of course, the Magi failed miserably. And the king had said, because of that, if they could not do what he had requested of them, he would kill them all. And so he gave the execution order. And Daniel and his three friends, who were now part of the Magi order as a result of chapter 1 and fulfilling their exams so well, were now facing a death sentence. And we've been studying how, in the midst of that death sentence, that we've been learning lessons on how to face impossible situations. Number one, that you don't fall apart in the midst of them. You trust God in his plan in the midst of very unexpected, difficult circumstances. We talked about the importance of getting more information so that you can better understand the nature of the crisis. And then yesterday, or last time, we were talking about gaining more time and seeking to gain time so that you don't have to act prematurely in the midst of a difficult circumstance. Now today, in these verses that I read to you, we discover yet a fourth of these responses and lessons in the midst of impossible situations. And it's a very straightforward one. Daniel enlisted the prayer support of his brothers in the Lord. Daniel believed that prayer was a practical and useful response to an impossible situation, to a crisis situation. Why? Because Daniel believed that God was really there. He believed that the God who was really there acts in history and acts in this world. He acts in time and space to touch the world in which we find ourselves. The God Daniel believed in, the God with whom Daniel was in right relationship, was a very different God than the God of the Magi. You remember back in verse 11 of this chapter, the Magi said, the thing the king asks is difficult. No one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. In other words, the gods, false gods, but the gods that the Magi believed in were disconnected gods. They were not gods like the one who created the heavens and the earth and interacts in the world. Their gods were distant, uninvolved. Daniel believed in an involved God, and he turned to that God in prayer, and he enlisted his three friends in the midst of responding to the God who's really there in the face of his impossible situation. In this case, his three friends he still calls at this point in the story by their Jewish names: Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. They would later, of course, be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls them by their Hebrew names. And he says, listen, we need to combine together, and the four of us bring these issues before God. We need to turn to God in the midst of the crisis. Prayer and prayer support is part of God's intention among believers. He intends that we would turn to one another. I'm not saying turn and say, everybody in America pray for X and Y and Z. No. But you turn to that circle of people who are redeemed as well, who are your friends, who are your church, and you turn to them in the midst of life crises. And together you pray about them. You bring the issues before the Lord. Such prayer is one of the benefits of koinonia, Christian fellowship. It's what God intends for his children. That's why, by the way, in our church, we share prayer concerns every time we meet. And then we pray for those concerns. Then we pray for them in between our times of meeting, because prayer is important. And prayer is a practical thing we can do for one another, because prayer helps in crisis. I was thinking of 2 Corinthians chapter 1 in this regard. Paul is speaking in the opening chapter of 2 Corinthians about his life, and he was facing his own crisis. In fact, he tells us in the chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians that he despaired of life. He thought everything was so disastrous that he despaired of life itself. But then he makes this comment about prayer. In verse 11 he says, "You also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf and blessings granted us through the prayers of many." You see, you must help us with prayer. Are you helping others with prayer? Such a practical way to help. Many were praying for me during my past illness. Thank you for those prayers. We work together and pray for one another. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11 in action. And so Daniel drew upon the prayer support of his brothers in the Lord. In the midst of the crisis, they prayed together. Now I want you to also notice something here. He said to them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. They turned to God in prayer and they asked for mercy, not merely the answer. Why? Because they didn't approach God with some sort of prideful name it and claim it mentality, like they were in the driver's seat. God was obligated as if he was some sort of genie to grant their wishes. Oh no, that's not how they approached God. They didn't see that God owed them something. No, instead, they knew they didn't deserve even the mercies of God. But they came before God asking for undeserved action from God. Oh Lord, I don't deserve it, but would you show mercy? Would you act in a certain fashion? Would you answer in this particular crisis situation and show your hand, show your strength? How do you approach prayer? Do you have a prideful belief that somehow you're in the driver's seat, that God is obligated to do what you ask? Brothers and sisters, don't you remember Jesus praying in the garden? Not my will, but thine be done. That's the essence of prayer. Not that I get what I want, but that thy will be done. And in mercy, Lord, would you see fit in your will to answer what I am requesting of you. That's how Daniel came to God. That's how his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah came to God. Is that how you're coming to God in the midst of the crisis of your life? I pray that you are. I pray that you're doing that. They specifically, after coming before God and asking for God's mercy, they specifically asked God to intervene to save them. It's not wrong to ask that. I ask God for that. But always, Lord, thy will be done, not mine. I want to be like Jesus in the garden. I want to trust your purposes even when I don't understand them. And therefore, Lord, here's what I would desire to see. But beyond that, what I really desire is that your will be done. And then what did God do in response to all of this? Well, I read it to you. He showed mercy. During the night, he revealed the mystery to Daniel. And Daniel responds to it in this way. By the way, I didn't read the verse, but I'll read it to you. In verse 23, he says, "And now you have made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Daniel responds to God in response to God's answer here, and he says, we, us. In other words, we prayed together. And you answered us. Do you follow it? That's how we help one another. We pray together. Well, join me tomorrow, Lord willing, and we'll continue in our study of Daniel and see how Daniel now faces the situation. God bless.